Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is Game 10 from the 2014 World Chess Championship match between Magnus Carlsen and Viswanathan Anand. Going into this game, Carlsen has a 5 points to 4 lead in this race to 6.5 points to determine a winner. And Anand with the white pieces in this one, he opens with d4. This still remains a very close match. Anything can happen. We once again have d4 being played by Anand when he has the white side, and just like we saw in Game 1, to turn the clocks back a bit, but we did see this already in Game 1. That's how this match started. We're once again revisiting in this Game 10 the Grunfeld defense. Things are different on this move 4, however. In Game 1, what followed was c takes d, knight takes, and then bishop d2. However, this time we have knight f3, and on bishop g7, it's queen b3, entering the Russian variation of the Grunfeld, applying more pressure to the black center. Black gives the center up, and will now look to strike at white's pawn mass in the center, the d4 and e4 structure. How will black go about doing just that? How to get in c5 or e5? Knight a6 is played. It seems a bit awkward to deploy the knight on the edge, but it is facilitating this c5 advance. Bishop e2, c5 it is, and on d5 the move e6 is played. Doing something other than d5, such as d takes c, runs into bishop to e6, development with tempo, and then rook to c8. The black pieces are now very active, white still having to castle and get their bishop out. This pawn, keep in mind, is also not so easily defended. Bishop e3, well, notice that's not a reliable square. It could be kicked around with knight to g4. This is not necessarily the best direction for white to go in. Instead, it was d5, e6, castles, e takes d, and this is where we stand. Very imbalanced position, pawn structure-wise at least, and very rich possibilities for imbalances. Namely, two minor pieces versus a rook and pawn can show up on board, two bishops versus a knight and bishop, a minor piece and pawn versus a rook. Very lively position. Anything can happen in this game. This pawn needs to be kept under lock and key. Can't necessarily blockade him at his earliest point for as long as this guy's around. You could be sure knight b5 will be there to watch over d6 if black is trying to blockade. First things first, however, rook e8 it is, an open file. A decision for white. This is the first think of the game. What to do with the bishop, if anything at all, just yet. Rook d1 is an idea. Bishop e3, f4, g5, maybe. You could also consider retaining the bishop's options. Play a3 just to watch out for the b4 square. It seems a little bit slow, but nevertheless, this move 12, many ideas here, many moves to go with. He chooses bishop g5, provoking h6 and only then returning to e3. We'll see in a little bit that white, in fact, makes use of that pawn advance, puts pressure on it. Bishop f5, rook a d1, behind that passed pawn. Knight e4, a new move that was available as soon as bishop f5 is in. You could jump into that square, and now we have white's queen knight and black's king knight being exchanged. This bishop is unmasked with this last move, knight e4. Decision point for black right here, how to recapture. This is where some time was spent, about 10 minutes. Take with the rook or the bishop in such an open position. This is really the first one to be looking at. Gives the most direction to the white side. And typical reaction is to do what exactly? In these open dynamic positions, you try to meet punch with counter punch. This is one way to do it. At some stage, you're threatening to grab on h6, not just yet because you have a loose piece on e2, but on rook takes e4, there is the counterattacking queen c1. Again, this is not yet a threat because of rook takes bishop here, but there is ideas of maybe grabbing the knight or even playing to first d3 and only then taking here. One interesting follow-up could include knight b4, and, well, this pawn is hit. If he's moving, there's even this cute move, knight c2. What is that doing? Well, on queen takes knight, there's rook takes e. Rook takes bishop. We don't go in that direction, but nevertheless, it should be a top candidate choice in your own thought process, the one that gives the most direction to your opponent, especially in these open positions, where having the move at hand is very, very important. Okay, well, in the game, it was bishop takes knight, pressure on the knight and pawn. d6 could be played here, but instead it was queen to c1. d6 would have been interesting with bishop to c6. Is this pawn a liability or an asset? He might get tracked down. He might be more accessible on this d6 square. Moves like rook e6, bishop f8, and he can fall. White would have counterplay, maybe against c5 and or h6 was an interesting alternative. We didn't have that. Instead, it was queen c1, an immediate punch is being thrown at h6. It's also clearing the way for, maybe in some cases, you could grab the knight on a6 and then the pawn on c5. Black follows with simply developing, ignoring the threat here, throwing a punch of his own. Attack here is met with a counterattack against b2. And something other than queen to f6. If you're grabbing this pawn here, that is not a wise choice. This would be doing what exactly? Throwing yourself into a pin. There can follow bishop takes knight, queen takes pawn. What are you doing about this bishop? You're losing. Not a good choice. In the game, it was queen f6. H pawn is falling, and in return, black gets the b pawn, and with that, the queens also are exchanged. One other idea at this stage here is to not grab on b2, but rather g7, and on queen takes queen, rook takes, king takes bishop, mass exchanges, and after the smoke clears, both players agreed afterward in the press conference sharing some of their ideas. They agreed that there's really not much life in this position after rook to d1, rook to b8 looking for rook b5. This pawn, it's tough to see how that guy gets rolling. Just making a passing move if, I don't know, if this h4 move is played, there's rook b5, rook takes rook, pawn takes, and what exactly are you doing here? On d6 you could take the knight, and then this pawn could be tracked down. White maybe has to be a little bit careful here. This pawn is certainly going to be scooped up in short order. We didn't have that. We didn't have this variation where white captures on g7, but rather it's the immediate queen takes queen. The dark square bishops, in other words, remain on board. And as a follow-up, knight g5. Now, if you take a look at the clocks right here, they're not accurate for this next move. This is where there was a big think on the black side. Clearly, there's this idea of having a knight for bishop exchange, having that minor piece imbalance on board. After this next move, we see that it only registers about 2 minutes being spent, but really this was a half hour. The clocks are just a little bit off. Well, a lot off, but anyhow, this next move took about a half hour here on black's 19th move. He ends up going with bishop to d4. Now, what exactly was being considered here? Well, for one, if you're playing bishop to f5, in fact, let me try something else. If you're avoiding this knight for bishop exchange with, let's say, bishop to c2, in fact, let me show something other than bishop to c2. If bishop takes pawn here, that's no good because of this, and only then recapturing. One of the ideas you may have thought is to have bishop takes pawn, and then if the bishop's taken, well, you get this guy in e2, but white would first grab this knight and only then grab the bishop. So grabbing the pawn is no good is what I'm getting at. Playing here may seem a bit appealing, but notice how after rook d2, what are you doing about these guys? If knight b4 is played with the idea of, let's say, hitting the rook yet again, there is the move d6, and on bishop c3, you can pick up that light square bishop, and look out. What's happening to f7? It's falling, and black is in a very bad position. Black is losing this position. The evaluation is reading approximately 2.5, which is too much. Can't go in that direction of playing to c2. Certainly can't grab on d5. And just a funny little note, when I was live streaming this, there was a relay error. And we have the move bishop takes g2. a move that many of you were suggesting on Twitter, and it was just a relay error. I'm just pointing this out. It's not a good choice because of bishop takes knight, bishop takes rook, and bishop takes bishop. Anyhow, just a fun little fact there. There was a relay issue. For some reason, bishop takes pawn was played. In the game, it was bishop to d4. One other interesting line at this stage, instead of bishop d4, is yet again another bishop move. Bishop f5. I thought we could see bishop f5. However, this is another interesting option that white would have as a follow-up. We could arrive at this ensuing more simplified ending with black playing bishop g7 and then white crashing through on f7. What do you do about that? On f6, there's d7. We could enter this ending, which I thought was quite interesting, and I wasn't quite sure how exactly to assess this. Black has a passed pawn. White clearly has a passed pawn just a step away. I'm not sure who stands the better side. Very difficult endgame to assess. We didn't have that. We didn't have the bishop move. Instead, again, a half hour spent on this one. Carlsen decides on bishop d4, locking down the rook from defending this d5 pawn. Now black is in a position to grab him, but of course white snaps that bishop off before he can. Rook takes, so this is where we stand now, the two bishops and a passed pawn. Minor piece in balanced position. Pawn structure, a minor piece in balanced position as well a pawn structure in balanced position. The rook drops back, e7 it is. This does run into d6 with tempo, we do have that. Rook d7, bishop f4, you need to hang on to that guy. Knight b4 hits the a2 pawn, and during the live stream I was pointing out, well, this is really the knee-jerk reaction to not want to, babysit the pawn with a piece, but instead just give him a kick. But in the game it was rook to d2. This is making way for the rook to play to the b1 or c1 squares, so it has its purposes. As a follow-up, rook to e8, rook c1, rook e6, looking to track down that pawn, soon looking to interfere with the bishop, coordinating on the d6 square. h4, flight square, and at some stage there can even be h5 to try and break down the kingside pawn structure. Bishop e5, so some smoke is now clearing with these dark square bishops being exchanged. No longer does white have the bishop pair. It's now a knight versus bishop situation, but as it follows up here, we have bishop takes b7, and this is now going right in for basically a drawn position. Just like that, this is clearing up quite a bit where we end up in a rook, two rooks, well, just a rook ending where there's nothing really to play for. After rook to d2, it is at this point that the players agree to a draw. There's no life. We went from having a lot of life in the position to this one petering out to, a dead drawn position. The computer evaluation is locked in at zeros. Not really a way to make progress. White has their base points covered. Black could play rook to c7, keep his base points covered. What exactly is there to coordinate on? Where is there a great weakness? Not really seeing it. Tough to even get this guy rolling. No good progress to be made in this position, and rightly so. The players agreed to a draw. And with that, this gets pushed to 5.5 points for Carlsen and 4.5 points for Anand. And so with any game now, we could have a champion. Carlsen is just 1 point away. He has the black pieces, which will be played on Sunday, November 23rd at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Be sure to check that out in some way, and we'll see what happens. At any moment, we could now have a world champion crowned. So we'll see what takes shape. We'll see if Carlsen is able to get a win. If it turns out to be a draw in Game 11, well, we're pushed to now Game 12, and you could be sure that that one will be intense. Anand will be going all out. We'll see what happens soon enough. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.